Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar, Transitioning to the New Arborist and Forest Operative Apprenticeship Standards. Thanks for joining us. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to explain a few things about our webinar platform to allow you to get the most out of the experience. All viewers will be in listen-only mode. To engage with our webinar, please use the on-screen panel. You can use this to adjust your audio settings and the question tab to engage with us. We expect that our webinar will be very popular, but our team will do their best to answer your questions and queries. During our webinar, we will be running a number of polls. To record your response, please click on the on-screen voting button when asked to do so. After the webinar, we will be providing a recording, a copy of the slides, and a question and answers document for your unanswered questions. Now I'd like to hand over to our presenters, John Wray and Dr. Robin Jackson.
Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I'm Robin Jackson. I'm the Industry Manager for Land-Based Forest City and Guilds. And welcome to the second of our land-based specific apprenticeship webinars. In the webinar this afternoon, I'm going to give you a recap on the new Arborist and Forest Operative Apprenticeship Standards, focusing on what you need to know, outline how City and Guilds can support you with the mandatory qualifications, outline our EPA service for Arborist and Forest Operative, and look at some next steps and give you the option to pose some questions, which we will try and pick up at the end of the webinar. Just before I come to our first poll, just to give you a little bit of context to these standards, these are associated with some apprenticeship reforms that are related to conversion from the SASE frameworks in England, which are going to be phased out once all the new apprenticeship standards have been implemented. And over a number of years, we're moving from approximately 250 frameworks to over 800 standards. It is quite important to remember that these changes currently only apply to apprenticeships in England. So apprenticeship frameworks in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland remain unchanged. So I will move over to our first poll question.
Okay, you're going to see the poll question flash up on your screen very shortly. And our first poll question is, where are you with transitioning to the new Arborist or Forest Operative standards? And the options you have are all starts are on the new standards, the starts on a combination of SASE and new standards, or the starts are only on the SASE frameworks. Okay, thank you for voting. I'm going to share the results with you now. As you can see, 80% of you had all starts on the new standards, while 20% of you followed on the starts only on the SASE frameworks. Thank you for sharing.
Okay, so thank you for that. So if we start off a little bit more of the big picture in terms of an overview of the current apprenticeship standards within agriculture, environmental and animal care, City and Guilds is listed as an approved endpoint assessment organisation on the official ESFA register for these 4 standards. And during our first webinar on Friday the 1st of June, we covered Golf Greenkeeper and Horticulture Landscape Operative. For those interested, the recording of that webinar is available to view on the City and Guilds website. In this webinar, we're going to consider Arborist and Forest Operative. Both are nominally at level 2, and it's just worth pointing out that Forest Operative has 2 pathways, establishment and maintenance and harvesting. Arborist, there are no pathways. So for those unfamiliar with the standards, I just want to give a brief overview of what you're probably familiar with, which is the SASE frameworks and how they compare against the new apprenticeship standards. So the SASE frameworks from a provider and employer's perspective, you're probably used to having an initial assessment. You'll then move on to the on-the-job and off-the-job training element, and you're probably used to delivering a work-based diploma, which was the mandatory combined qualification, so the trees and timber work-based diplomas. Now, once the apprentice had achieved the diploma, they had achieved their required English and maths, they'd completed their personal learning and thinking skills and their employment rights and responsibilities workbook, then as the training provider, you would claim the completion and the certification, and the apprentice would be deemed to be occupationally competent. With the standards, it's a little bit different. You still have an initial assessment at the start, and I would suggest that this initial assessment is going to have to be a little bit more robust than perhaps it's been with the frameworks. You then enter the on-program phase. Now, this is where your relationship with City and Guilds is going to be slightly different. In the old, I could say the framework days, you would have had visits and support from our EQAs associated with the work-based diplomas. But the work-based diplomas are no longer a requirement for the new standard. So in many respects, many of you will not really have any direct interaction with City and Guilds until the apprentice gets close to the gateway. Now, on this on-program phase, the apprentices are required to achieve any mandatory qualifications. They're still required to achieve English and maths, and there's going to have to be some formative assessment of behaviour. Now, when the employer and the apprentice and the training provider are all in agreement that the apprentice is competent and they've completed everything they need to within the on-program phase of their apprenticeship, then they reach what's known as the gateway. So once everybody deems the apprentice to be competent, the apprentice goes through the gateway and is put forward for endpoint assessment. And endpoint assessment is undertaken by an independent assessor, and should the employer choose to use City and Guilds, it will be our appointed assessor that will undertake the endpoint assessment. Following successful achievement, the apprentice will complete, they'll be certificated, and then viewed as occupationally competent. So let's look at the two standards in turn. So the Arborist Apprenticeship Standard, it's at level 2. In terms of the gateway, they must achieve English and Maths at level 1, but must have taken the test at level 2. Doesn't make much difference whether they pass or not. Ideally they should, and it would be to the student's advantage for them to achieve at level 2, but it's not a requirement. They must achieve all mandatory qualifications. They must compile a portfolio and demonstrate sufficient evidence of competence. They must also show evidence of the relevant arborist knowledge, skills and behaviours as set out in the standard, and they must also provide evidence that they've completed the 20% off the job training requirement. So if we look then at the endpoint assessment itself, we'll start off with the holistic project. Now the project should take 1 week away from the workplace to complete and is designed to test an apprentice's knowledge and application across many areas of the standard. Preparation for the project should take place during the apprenticeship, for example, collection of samples or images demonstrating principles listed in the standard. The holistic project must be submitted at least 3 weeks prior to the structured interview and marked by the independent assessor ahead of the structured interview. Now, the structured interview itself will take 60 minutes, and the interview will be based on the holistic project as well as the portfolio that the apprentice has put together whilst on the on-program phase of their learning. There are then online multiple choice knowledge tests, which will take 2 hours, have 70 questions each, with a minimum of 4 response options, and these will occur under controlled conditions. Finally, there are practical tests. These will be time-bound and take 3 hours in total to complete. The employer and sitting guilds will decide the assessment location either at an assessment centre or more probably in the workplace. These tests must occur under controlled conditions, and sitting guilds will define the resources required, with only those sites with these resources able to be used. Looking at the Forest Operative Apprenticeship Standard, there's an awful lot of similarity between it and the Arborist. They're both at level 2. English and maths must still be achieved at level 1, and the apprentices must have taken the test for level 2. Again, they must have achieved all their mandatory qualifications, compile a portfolio, and demonstrate sufficient evidence of competence. They must also show evidence of the relevant forest operative knowledge, skills and behaviours as set out in the standard, and provide evidence they've completed the 20% off-the-job training requirement. Now, the endpoint assessment, once the apprentice goes through the gateway, is slightly different. There is an online multiple choice test, which is 90 minutes long with 60 questions that have a minimum of 4 response options each. The apprentice will also undertake 5 real-work practical tests with verbal knowledge questions. Again, sitting guilds will set the exercise, but examples have been provided by the employer group in the training specification and in the assessment plan associated with the standard. Verbal questioning relevant to these practical tests will be undertaken, and the questioning may take place before, during, or after the practical tests. These tests will be time-bound and will take approximately 6 hours in total to undertake. Similar to the Arborist apprenticeship, the employer and sitting guilds will decide the assessment location either at an assessment centre or, more probably, in the workplace. And again, the tests must occur under controlled conditions, and sitting guilds will define the resources required. Only sites with these resources can be used. We've mentioned the gateway. The gateway forms the start of the endpoint assessment process. It can be triggered after 12 months of starting the apprenticeship, but I will just flag up that the typical duration for an apprentice for both the Arborist and Forest Operative pathways, both Forest Operative pathways, are 24 months. Once the gateway is triggered, you should complete the gateway declaration form, and then you can book the endpoint assessment 60 to 90 days in advance of the EPA taking place. And this is to provide us with sufficient time to undertake the checks we need to do to make sure that the EPA is appropriate and the resources are in place. So where can you find out more information about the apprenticeship itself? The Institute for Apprenticeships have a very good website, and if you follow the link, you'll find a web page dedicated to the Arborist and another one dedicated to the Forest Operative Standard. So if we look at the Arborist one, you can find some information in terms of which employers were involved in creating the standard. There is a useful email address if you've got any queries directly to do with the standard. And it is worth pointing out that the standard and the assessment plan are not written by sitting guilds, they are written by the employer group. And we, as an endpoint assessment organisation, have to work to the requirements as set out in the assessment plan. So if you have queries to do with the assessment plan or the standard, the employer group is probably better placed to answer those questions, although we will, of course, try and answer them for you. You can also find information about the typical duration, which I've mentioned is 24 months, as well as the maximum funding available. It is also worth noting that you can print the occupational standard, and you can download and also print out the Arborist assessment plan. And I would strongly recommend that if you are intending to offer this apprenticeship standard, that you print out both, because there's an awful lot of information in both of them that you will find very helpful and useful. And finally, down at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, there is an option for employers where they can enter their postcode and they can find apprenticeship training providers that deliver this standard within their area, which is quite a useful reference point. As I've said, this is the page for Forest Operative. There's an awful lot of useful information here and useful signposting that I would strongly recommend that you visit. So, key documents for these standards. The actual standard document themselves, usually 2, possibly 3 pages in length. They're short, they're easy to understand, and they describe the competencies. So that's the skills, the knowledge and behaviours expected of a competent apprentice, or an apprentice who is deemed to be competent. They've been designed by the employer groups and they've been approved by the IFA. The assessment plan, a little bit more detailed, usually about 20 to 25 pages long. They outline what will be assessed, how it will be assessed, and who will be assessed by. And it also provides some useful information to support providers and employers in delivering the on-programme learning. Sitting Guilds are also working on EPA customer packs, and these will be available for customers who have registered with us to be your EPA provider. They describe the EPA process in detail, and they give you some requirements to help you prepare for the endpoint assessment process. I would also flag up that in many ways we're very fortunate with the employer group that pulled together these standards, because they have provided quite detailed training specifications and some support materials which are freely available on the National Land-Based College website. They are referenced towards the start of both assessment plans, and I would encourage you to visit the NLBC website and look at the training specifications and associated resources. So, the off-the-job training, or the vital 20%. Most of us are fairly familiar with this, but for those who are not, this off-the-job training must be directly relevant to the apprenticeship standard and must take place within the apprentice's normal working hours. And here are some examples of things that can legitimately contribute to this 20%. It is important to note that if an apprentice is required to work on top of their usual weekly hours, so at weekends, for example, providing weekend cover on a rota or managing a visitor experience, these additional hours must be used to calculate the 20%. We would strongly recommend that training providers and employers agree right at the very start of the apprentice's journey who will be delivering the off-the-job training and how that will fit into the apprentice's journey. To try and support you, and one of the challenges for training providers in the past has always been English and maths, City and Guilds has a range of smart screen resources specifically built around our functional skills qualifications, and helpfully these are free to any centre. So if you're not used to using SmartScreen, or you don't have access to it, if you're a Sitting Guilds customer, you speak to your local business manager, or if you're new to us, if you speak to customer service, our customer service team will happily try and sort of steer you in the direction to be able to access these. And these resources, just a couple of quick screenshots, are available for English and Maths from Entry 1, Entry 2, Entry 3, up to Level 2. So there's a spectrum of resources freely available to support you. So looking at the mandatory qualifications that are identified within the appropriate standards, I'll start off with Arborist. There's quite a few of them. The ones highlighted in blue are those offered either by Sitting Guilds or under our NPTC sub-brand. The one that we do not offer is the Level 2 Award in Emergency First Aid at Work. Now, this qualification has recently been updated nationally by all awarding organisations who offer this. And we believe that the IFA and the ESFA are currently looking at this to make sure that the standard, so when apprentices come to the gateway, that the new qualification, if used, will allow the apprentice to move through the gateway. If you are interested in any of the qualifications highlighted in blue, you can find further information on the main Sitting Guilds or our NPTC websites. Mandatory qualifications should not be considered to be limiting. So if the apprentice would benefit from achieving additional qualifications or doing work where they require a specific qualification not listed, these can be included in their on-programme study, but they should be agreed between the training provider and the employer at the start, as funding may not be available to cover all costs. So looking at the Forest Operative mandatory qualification, or qualifications, there are some which are identified as core. So all Forest Operative apprentices must achieve these, and then depending upon which pathway they choose, there are different other ones that they must achieve. And again, we have highlighted those offered by Sitting Guilds NPTC. Now, I'll just flag up, under Establishing Maintenance, the Level 2 Principles of Safe Handling and Application of Pesticides Guidance is actually PA1, and what most of you would know is PA1. The word guidance is actually a cut and paste error within the standard. So if you could ignore the word guidance, that qualification is our PA1. So we're now going to move to our next poll question.
Okay, poll question number 2. What are your biggest challenges associated with preparing apprentices for EPA? And the options you have are preparing apprentices so they know what to expect, delivering on programme to embed knowledge, skills and behaviours, judging when the apprentice is ready for EPA, or monitoring the apprentice's progress during the on programme. Okay. As you can see, it's a pretty even split between preparing apprentices so they know what to expect and delivering on programme to embed knowledge, skills and behaviours. Thank you for voting.
Thank you for that. So, in order to support apprentices to prepare for their endpoint assessment, Sitting Guilds have available an EPA preparation tool. This is an online tool that is available to every apprentice that registers with Sitting Guilds to be their endpoint provider, endpoint assessment provider. It's available online, it's available 24 hours a day, and it's designed so that the apprentice is presented with standard, relevant and useful learning resources verified to be applicable and relevant to the assessment methods. So if the apprentice is asked to undertake a knowledge test, an exam, an online multiple choice exam, then they will be presented with preparation materials designed to prepare them for that. It's accessed via smart screen. So again, if you're familiar with smart screen, if you're not, please get in contact with Sitting Guilds and we will support you to be able to access this resource once you register your apprentices with us for EPA. In terms of our EPA service, I want to bring to your attention our EPA manual to support you through the process. It's available on our website and it provides a lot of detailed information and guidance about how the process works from an administrative perspective. And I really would recommend that those in the training providers' offices who deal with arranging the EPA service have a good look at this. It's a very useful publication. We've also undertaken a recent webinar about the EPA booking process and how to support the assessment methods, which it's worth accessing. Some useful information in it. So looking at the EPA for Arborists, just a little bit of a recap. There are 4 assessment elements being used. The online multiple choice tests, which will be on the Sitting Guilds Evolve platform. There's a holistic project, there's a structured interview, and there's practical tests. In terms of the grading, each assessment element is graded as follows. The knowledge tests are fail, less than 60%, pass, 60 to 79%, and distinction, 80% and over. For the other 3 assessment elements, please refer to the grading table for the pass and distinction criteria. To pass overall, all elements must be achieved at pass or above. To get a distinction overall, all elements must be achieved at distinction. If any element of the EPA is failed by the apprentice, they are allowed 3 retakes, which can be taken over a 6-month period from the first date of the EPA. And there is no cap on grading placed on apprentices who need to retake. Therefore, for Arborist, there's a maximum of 4 attempts per EPA task. However, an apprentice can't retake with the aim of getting a higher grade. They can only retake if they fail. In terms of EPA for Forest Operative, again, quick recap. This time there were 2 assessment elements, multiple choice test and practical tests, with each graded as follows. So the knowledge test, same grade boundaries as for Arborist, and similar to Arborist for the practical tests, please refer to the grading table. Similarly, to achieve a pass overall, all elements must be achieved at pass or above, and to get a distinction overall, all elements must be achieved at distinction. However, there's a slight difference here, because if any element of the EPA is failed, only 2 retakes can be taken. So with Arborist, you're allowed 3 retakes. For Forest Operative, you're only allowed 2. So please do bear that in mind. In terms of our EPA service, we have a fairly simple pricing structure with 2 charging points. We have an initial registration fee, which is a non-refundable fee of £25 when the apprentice is registered for EPA on our system, and that will release the online support tool. The balance of the payment is due after the assessor enters the results. So the way this works is you will have received nearly all, if you're a training provider, of your funding from the employers by this point, so this will help your cash flow. We have no hidden charges, and within our fees we include any third-party fees related to external quality assurance. Also, to support you, we're developing EPA customer packs for each standard, which will be available over the summer. They'll provide information on how to book the EPA and also how to prepare for the specific endpoint assessment elements that the apprentice will be asked to undertake for the relevant standard they're working towards.
Okay, we've got one more poll question for you. It's going to pop up on your screen shortly. This poll is, how much are your employers likely to be involved in planning for EPA once the apprentice has reached the gateway? And the options that you have are employers to decide endpoint assessment organisation to be used. Employers will look to us to recommend an endpoint assessment organisation, or employers will look to us to state which EPAO to be used. Brilliant, thank you for voting. I'm going to share the responses now. As you can see, 80% of you said that employers will look to you to recommend an EPAO, and this was followed by 20% saying that employers will look to us to state specifically which EPAO to be used. So thank you again for voting.
Okay, in terms of results and resets, the way the results and resets work, if the apprentice passes all their assessment elements, then Sitting Guilds will issue a statement of achievement. We will claim the apprentice certificate from the Institute of Apprenticeships, who will in turn post the certificates directly to the employer. If the apprentice fails, Sitting Guilds will issue a formal notification and feedback on which areas were failed. Retakes can then be booked through the walled garden on a component-by-component basis, and Sitting Guilds will reopen access to the apprentice's EPA portal to allow that to take place. Now, unfortunately today we do not have sufficient time to go into funding in any great depth, but this may be something we offer at a later date. You're probably familiar with the actual funding models. There's a co-investment model where 90% is paid for by the government, with usually a 10% contribution from the employer with some incentives available, or for those larger employers they will have access to their apprenticeship levy where they've got a wage bill of 3 million or more. Now, what can you use the funding, either from the co-investment model or the apprenticeship levy, to pay for? You can use it to pay for training and formative assessment directly associated with the standard. You can use it to pay for the EPA. You can also use it to pay for any EPA resets, retakes, up to the 20% EPA limit. And depending on whether they're classified as licensed to practice, potentially the training, registration, assessment and certification costs associated with the mandatory qualifications. Now, this latter license to practice funding is not fully clear. We are aware that clarification is being sought on this, and the IFA and ESFA are working collaboratively to resolve it. So we're unable to provide you with a definitive guide as to whether you can use what element of the funding you can use towards the license to practice qualifications that are mandated within the relevant standards. In terms of our assessors, Sitting Guilds have recruited over 100 highly qualified assessors across a range of subjects, and this is growing. Our assessors go through quite a detailed vetting process and are industry experts, and we train them to help apprentices feel relaxed and show their best during assessment. If you or anybody you know is interested in joining our assessor team, please look at the Sitting Guilds website, and specifically our independent endpoint assessment assessor page.
Now we've got two final poll questions for you. They're going to pop up on the screen very shortly. The first of which is, at what stage in the apprentice's journey will you likely register them for endpoint assessment? And the options that you have are, as soon as they start, halfway through their on-program phase, towards the end of their on-program phase, or not until they have passed through the gateway. Okay, thank you for voting. I'm going to share the responses now. As you can see, 83% of you said towards the end of their on-program phase, and that was followed by 17% saying halfway through their on-program phase. Thank you, that's very interesting. We've also got one final poll question, and this last one is, when will your first apprentice be ready for endpoint assessment? And the options that you have are before January 2019, between January and March 2019, between April and June 2019, July to September 2019, and October 2019 onwards. Okay, brilliant. Thank you for voting. I'm going to share the responses with you again. As you can see, a bit more of a mixed bag with this one. 50% of you went for October 2019 onwards. That was followed by July to September, 33%. And finally, it was between January and March, the remaining 17% of you said. So thank you very much for voting. We really do find this useful.
Okay, so in terms of further support from Sitting Guilds, we have two dedicated technical advisors, B. Esdale and John Wray, who are available to support centres and training providers. We've got a range of pre-recorded webinars on endpoint assessment, funding, non-programme resources, and this webinar bank will grow as time moves on. And we're also looking for centres and training providers to help us host network events to support you with endpoint assessment. So if you are interested in hosting a network event, please get in touch with either B or John, who will be delighted to have a conversation with you. So finally, kind of thank you for taking the time out of what is quite a hot and warm Friday afternoon to join us for this webinar. Couple of other useful reference points. In terms of outline queries, please discuss any issues with your local business manager. They can help signpost you to where you can find more information. For general apprenticeship inquiries, we have a dedicated email address, apprenticeships@sittingguilds.com. You can register for email updates. And for more information on the new standards or other resources, if you don't have a local business manager, you can go through our direct sales team, which is directsales@sittingguilds.com. And finally, if there are any questions you would like to pose, we'll now give you an opportunity to pose them, and we will try and give you an as open and honest an answer as we possibly can. Thank you very much for taking time to listen.
Brilliant, thank you. So if you have a question, type it into the question tab. We've overrun a little bit, but we've got 5 minutes to answer your questions. Even if we don't have time to answer them in this webinar, we will be following up with a Q&A document, so please just type them in and we'll start answering them shortly. Brilliant, thank you for your patience. We're now going to answer a few of your questions. Remember, if you have any you want us to answer, please do type them in and we'll do our best to answer them for you today.
Okay, I'm not sure whether you can see the questions, but some of the ones have been posed. First one, how many EPA assessors have been approved, and are there any in the Southwest? I don't have a figure to hand in terms of Southwest specific. What I would say is that if you book with Sitting Guilds for endpoint assessment, we will make sure that we will provide you with an endpoint assessor. Our assessors are available to travel the country, so I would just give you reassurance that wherever you are, we will have an assessor available. In terms of when will it be established that the level 3 first aid is available? That's a really interesting question, and I wish we could answer that. I know it's with the IFA at present. Certainly we believe that it should be acceptable. However, we are restricted by what appears in the standard. So I know the employer group are looking for clarification on that as we speak. So hopefully, I would expect we'll have an answer fairly shortly. I would be very surprised if the level 3 wasn't accepted, but I don't have the final say. And do you have any sample material for Arb and EPA? We will have a sample multiple choice test available. There are sample outline assessments provided by the employer group within the assessment plan. And I think actually if you look through the assessment plan and the training specification, you'll be able to see, I guess, or have a reasoned judgment as to the sort of tasks that are likely to come up. But we will have a sample knowledge paper available.
Brilliant. One last chance, if you do have questions, please do get them in. I think we've answered all the ones that we currently have up on the screen. So I'd like to say a big thank you for yourselves attending. I'd like to say a big thank you again to our presenters, John Wray and Dr. Robin Jackson. We hope you enjoy the rest of this lovely day, and we hope to see you on another webinar again soon.